So today I am going to show you the magnetic levitating racing track, which is one of the promising application of a superconductor. Superconductor has a basically a type of material which has a distinct properties, which is completely different than the normal material what you know, like copper or steel or this kind of materials. Now, as you know, that normal material, so this is a resistance versus temperature curve. Okay, as you reduce the temperature, the resistance of the normal material keep on reducing, and then it stabilizes its one of at the finite value. So it doesn't reaches to the zero. Whereas in a superconductor, when you start cooling a superconducting material, initially it follows the same trend as normal material, so it will keep on reducing and reducing, and then beyond a certain temperature the resistance suddenly vanishes and it becomes zero. Superconductor has also another distinct property. So you can see this red ball, okay, at normal temperature, that means at room temperature. If you apply a magnetic field, then all the field flux lines will pass through the superconductors. Okay. But if you cool that superconducting material to its superconducting states, that means you have to cool below its critical temperature. Then if you apply the same field, external magnetic field, it will expel all these magnetic fluxes. So it will not allow any magnetic flux to enter inside the superconductors. So it's a Meissner state. Now in this Meissner state, so the superconductor behave as a perfectly diamagnetic. So that means if you take a magnet, okay, normal magnet, if you place a superconductor on top of that, it will behave a diamagnetic. Okay, so that means it will create a as if it is creating opposing field. Okay, it will repel to the existing field or external field. Okay, now I take a one of the superconductor which is yttrium barium copper oxide. You can see here this is a ceramic type of material, and it is having the critical temperature of 92 Kelvin. 92 Kelvin. So that means if you want to make it a superconductor, you have to cool this material below 92 Kelvin. So to make it a superconductor, what we do, the nearest liquid we have a liquid nitrogen, which is having a boiling temperature of 77 Kelvin. So roughly minus 196 degrees centigrade. Now you think a diagram or three magnet north, south, north. So the magnetic flux line, what will happen? All the flux line from the north that will go to the south. So now if you place this YBCO material on top of this magnet, so there will be it will be a trapped inside a flux. Okay, because so this will reorient the flux line because of the its diamagnetic properties, and there will be a floating pockets will be generated on the top of this magnetic track. Now, if you have a series of such magnet, north, south, north, so if you have a series of such magnet, so you can think of a track, so there will be a floating path. So where the superconductor material doesn't have any contact with this path. So based on the same principle, you can see this is a magnetic track. It has a similar profile, magnet profile, so north, south, north. Okay. So now what we will do to demonstrate that magnetic levitations. So now this superconducting material generally embedded in a metallic metallic envelope. This 1 micron layer is coated. Now just to demonstrate, so I have taken a small superconducting tape. So this is superconducting tape, what I have explained. I have taken a small tape. So one, I will take similar one of the sample which is already dipped into the liquid nitrogen, and we'll put, now if you see, if I put this sample here, it is just, it's a normal, because now it is not in superconducting state, so it is not floating. Okay, so you can't do anything. Okay, now we will take one of the superconducting sample here. So it is floating completely. Okay, it's a floating, and almost there is a 3 millimeters of gap between this track and this superconducting samples. Now if I give a small impulse, you can see if I give a small impulse, so it is rotating and it's a floating actually. So there is no friction between the track and the sample, and here it is moving against the gravity because the track is inverted. Okay, so as long as we can maintain the temperature, it will be moving. So based on the same principle, actually the magnetic maglev train was developed in Japan. So Japanese, they could achieve almost 600 kilometer per hour speed. You can reach actually Bombay or 2.5 hours. So this is one of the very promising application which is coming in a future, and some of the countries are already working on this kind of projects. Thank you.
Thermoelectric materials. Basically, thermoelectric materials are the materials which convert thermal energy into the electrical energy and electrical into the thermal energy. It means these type of materials can be used in both ways. There are two different type of effects to demonstrate these type of materials. First one is the Seebeck effect, in which we have two different type of materials, metal A and metal B, and if we make junction of out of these two materials, suppose we put one junction as a hot and another junction as a cold, so in that case what will happen, there is a voltage developed between across these two junctions, and that voltage is measured with the help of the voltmeter. So the voltage difference generated due to the temperature gradient delta T gives the Seebeck coefficient of that junction. Suppose we have two different type of materials, one is N-type semiconductor and another one is P-type semiconductor. Both are connected electrically in series and thermally in parallel. So if we connect our circuit diagram like that, that one side is hot and another side is cold, due to that temperature gradient, the charge carriers will move from hot side to the cold side, and due to the movement of the charge carriers, a power will be generated into the circuit and our bulb will be the glow. So now I am going to demonstrate how this heat can be used as a electrical energy. It is our actual thermoelectric module circuit, in which we have two aluminum legs. These aluminum legs will supply heat or cold to the our thermoelectric module, and using that module we will convert that heat into the electricity, and we will use that electricity to power over this fan. So now I am going to demonstrate this. Here we are putting normal water into this beaker, so it will act as a hot side for our this reference, and in another beaker we will put liquid nitrogen that would act as a cold side for our material. So we are putting this circuit into that, so this will act as a hot side, this will act as a cold side, and we are putting. So now you can see the fan is moving without connecting to a electricity. So how this fan is moving, we have created the temperature difference, one is hot, one is cold. The temperature difference across this thermoelectric module is giving you a voltage, and that voltage is going to be used to power this fan. So these thermoelectric metals can be used to recover waste heat into the electricity.
Hello everyone. Today I am going to present Van de Graaff accelerators. Van de Graaff accelerators or Van de Graaff generators, you can say, was first invented by Robert Jamison Van de Graaff in 1931. This machine has the ability to produce extremely high voltages. They can go up to few millions of volts. Using this high potential, the charged particles are accelerated to very high energies, which are used for doing experiments in physics. So, for this understanding of this Van de Graaff generator, you first need to understand what is static electricity. See, this is a glass rod, and if you rub it with your cloth, then it develops some static charge, and it can attract small pieces of thermocol balls. So basically what is happening here is that the atoms give up electrons or take up electrons depending on their nature when we rub it across any surface. So this process of electrification by rubbing is called as turboelectricity. Let's start with the construction of this machine. There are two pulleys, the lower one and the upper one. There is a motor which rotates the lower pulley, and the belt is moving across this, and the belt is rotating the upper one. So now here is a battery which is connected to the spray comb. This battery gives the positive potential, and the positive charges accumulate on these pointed ends. These positive charges produce a very high electric field, and the air around it get ionized. So the air transfers this positive charge to the spray comb, from this spray comb to this belt, and this belt is continuously moving. So the belt carries the charge from here to the upper portion. A similar structure is available on the top side, where this spray comb picks up the positive charge and transfer it to the dome. Let's start this machine. This belt is continuously transferring the charge from lower to the upper portion, and this dome is charged. So now let's verify whether this dome is charged or not. This is a metal bowl which is connected to the ground, and when we place closer to it, a spark is occurring. You can see that. So what is basically happening here, when we put a metal bowl which is connected to the ground close to this, so this is very high potential, the air is getting ionized. So when we place it closer, the charges are getting discharged from here to ground. So this air is forming a discharge path. Take this thermocol bowl, put it here. Now this thermocol bowl is connected to this potential. So this is a complete body now. When I on these are having the same charges, and so they are repelling each other. These are some hairs. Turn it on and see. What is happening here? The hairs are getting same charge as its dome, and the similar charges are repelling each other. So they are shaping like this. So this is what happens when someone touches a charged body and gets goosebumps or hairs like this. This is all about this. We have learned today about the Van de Graaff generator. Thanks a lot.
Hope you all are aware of the concept of radioactive decay of nuclei, and if not, we'll learn it through the process of our demonstration. Here I have 22 sodium radioactive source, which has a half-life of 2.6 years. This radionuclide decays by emission of a positron, which is an antiparticle of electron, and when this positron recombines with the electrons of the matter, surrounding matter, it emits two 511 keV gamma radiation or gamma photons, and because of the law of conservation of momentum, the two emitted gammas are 180 degree apart. So this is the setup to demonstrate the emission of the two 511 keV gammas after the annihilation of positron and electron. Here we are using two barium fluoride detectors to detect the two gammas, and the detectors are also perfectly aligned to 180 degree. As you can see that since the detectors are perfectly aligned, that we are able to see two signals or two outputs from the detectors. This signifies that the two correlated gammas or the 180 degree emitted gammas are detected by the detector. Since the two detectors are perfectly aligned to 180 degree, we are able to see the two signals perfectly. However, any displacement or angular displacement of the detector would cause us to lose the correlation, and we would not have observed this signal. Now, you must be thinking, what is the application of this technique? So this has been used widely in the field of tomography, mainly the positron emission tomography. The setup is similar to what has been used here, except for an integrated set of detectors and a sophisticated processing and imaging technique. So, but however, for injection of the radionuclide into human body, we cannot use this particular source. So we use 18 fluorine source, which has a biological form of uh, fluoro 2 dioxy glucose, and the minimum dose which is injected in the human body is around 5 to 10 millicurie. These specific sources are synthesized in the surrounding cyclotrons, and this particular radionuclide has a half-life of 109.7 minutes. But coming back to the experiment, as you have seen, there is this continuous bed of noise on which the signal is riding. So this noise is partly coming from the atmospheric cosmic radiation that we always live in, and the other reasons are coming from the scattering of the accidental coincidence and the scattered coincidence. So the accidental coincidence refers to the detected photons that are coming from a different recombination process, and the scattered coincidence is the photon detected after a scattering. So this 18 fluorine radioisotope has an analog of glucose. So it tracks down the consumption of glucose within the human body, because the cancerous cells have a higher tendency of intake of the glucose, and this is how we detect the cancerous or the malignant cells. You must have also heard of the CT scan along with PET. That technique is also very popular, and that is computed tomography, because the attenuation coefficients of gamma rays or the photons is different for different organs, and so it is required to correct the PET scan, and there we use CT scan, where a gamma source of 511 keV is scanned across the body, and the PET scan is corrected with that image of the CT scan. That, having said that, that was associated with the oncology of the body. And coming to the neurology, I have a PET and CT scan result of a human brain, where you have a normal human brain and an abnormal human brain. So that the difference between the two can be clearly seen with where the flow of the glucose is strictly inhibited. So this is how the 18 fluorine radionuclide is used. And finally, this is not the limited application of this technique. There are other applications also in the field of research studies. Thank you.
Greetings to all. I am Golda. I am working in the field of nuclear physics. On hearing the word nuclear, people become panic. Why is it so? It's because actually because of the satanic outcomes of nuclear weapons or nuclear accidents that had happened in the past. Because of those effects, when we hear the word nuclear, we all become very cautious. But we don't have to worry much, because in our day-to-day life, we are directly or indirectly making use of nuclear physics or nuclear technology everywhere, every sphere of our life, like in medicine, agriculture, industry, and so on. For the radiation can be alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha is nothing but the helium nucleus. It has 2 protons and 2 neutrons. And beta is high energy electrons. And gamma is very high energy electromagnetic radiation. For as far as the radiation is concerned, we are bothered about the biological effects of it. When we are talking about the biological effect, we are concerned about the ionization property, or in a way the penetrating power of the radiation. For the penetrating power is inversely related to the ionization property. You know, we have a radioactive source and a nuclear radiation detector right on the ceiling of our house or school, cinema theater or shopping mall, etc. These are actually used for detecting the presence of smoke. So, there are mainly two types of smoke detectors. One is photoelectric and another one is ionization type. The ionization type, it has a radioactive material in it and it also makes use of nuclear technology for the detection. It has a ionization chamber with a radioactive source in the vicinity. Here, in case of normal smoke detectors, we use 241 americium. It is an alpha emitter. The quantity of the material used in the smoke detectors are very less. It is about 0.2 milligram. How does it work? It has a ionization chamber where here air is acting as the media of gas. So you apply a voltage across it and the source is kept here. For source is emitting radiation, alpha particles. These alpha particles ionize atoms in the air. The negatively charged ions produced there will get attracted towards the positive plate and the positive ion will be attracted towards the negative plate. For now, let us see. This is the internal part of the ionizing type smoke detector. This is the ionization chamber part. Within that, there is a hole and below that, the radioactive material is placed. Here it is americium 241. So it is continuously emitting alpha particles and ionizing this region, there within this region that you see here. So means the ions in the air in this region is getting ionized and the electrode here and on the back side is getting is collecting the ions produced here and a continuous current is going through. But when there is say smoke, then that current is stopped or it is reduced. Let us see. Yeah, how we make use of nuclear detector and radiation techniques in our day-to-day life.
So hello everyone, today I am going to demonstrate you that how resistivity of a material varies with the temperature. So let's start. So first of all, what is resistivity? Resistivity is a property of a material by which it opposes any motion of a charge passes through it. Okay, the unit of this is ohm meter, and on the basis of this resistivity value we can divide matter in basically in three categories. One is conductor, other is insulator, and then semiconductor. Okay, so these are some example of copper and aluminum, which are the metal. You can see here the value of these is around approximately 10 raised to the power minus 8 ohm meter, and silicon, which is a semiconductor, for this value is 10 raised to the power 2, and for the glass, which is an insulator, its value is 10 raised to the power 11. So first I will demonstrate you, then I will explain that how this variation is different for metal and the semiconductor. So now let's first consider the metal case. So this is a small circuit. Here we have a 9-volt DC power supply, and then this is the bulb, this is the switch, and here we have a copper coil. Now if I close this circuit, then current should flow through this circuit. If the current is sufficiently high, then this bulb should glow. So now let's see what happens if I close the circuit, then this bulb is not glowing. What does it mean? It means that the resistance offered by this coil is sufficiently high so that the current flowing in this circuit is low and this bulb is not glowing. So now what happens if I reduce the temperature of this particular coil? here we have liquid nitrogen. Temperature of this liquid nitrogen is 77 Kelvin. It is well below the room temperature. Now if I put this coil into this liquid nitrogen, then what you will observe, then this bulb will start glowing. What does it mean? It means that as we are going down in a temperature, then the resistance of this particular coil is reducing, and hence the current is increasing, and this bulb will start glowing. Okay, now let's move to the other part, which is of semiconductor. Here similar kind of a setup is here. Instead of bulb we have a LED, and instead of the copper coil we have a thermistor. It is a semiconductor. So now if I close this circuit, then at room temperature what we observe, this LED is glowing. It means that at room temperature the sufficient current is flowing to light up this LED. Let's reduce this temperature of this thermistor, and what we will observe, that it stopped glowing. It means at the lower temperature this thermistor is providing higher resistance to this circuit so that it is not glowing. So what you can see, that in case of a metal, from this graph, if we are reducing the temperature, the resistivity is decreasing. In case of the semiconductor, if we are reducing the temperature, then resistivity is increasing. So this is all for this concept. Thank you.
So the aim of the experiment is to demonstrate the total internal reflection of light and the how light can be bent at the curvature, and it can be reflected at the interfaces of the medium and travel along. So this is the point to be noted is this is the main working principle of optical fiber communication that we are experiencing in our day-to-day life today. So the main working principle of this experiment is to make you understand that light, when it is traveling from one medium to another medium, it bends away or towards the normal. So if it is bending from, if it is moving from high refractive index medium to low refractive index medium, that is from a denser medium to a rarer medium. Here we can have water as a denser medium and air as the rarer medium. So it basically bends away from the normal. So how we actually discuss this effect of total internal reflection is when the incident angle that is appearing at the medium interface, if it is increasing beyond a certain angle of incidence, it tends to bend away from the normal, and at a particular angle of incidence, which is known as critical angle, it becomes parallel to the interface, or it is normal to the it is perpendicular to the normal at the interface. And when it is going beyond that angle of incidence, it bends into it gets reflected into that medium itself. So as we can see here in this diagram, when the angle of incidence in the green ray, we can see when the angle of incidence is certain angle theta, which is less than a critical angle, it gets refracted away from the normal, but it is not getting perpendicular to the normal. When the red wave we can see it is getting perpendicular to the normal, so this particular angle is the critical angle, and the blue one, which is more than the critical angle, it shows that it gets reflected totally inside the medium which it was coming from. So this critical angle is governed by a popular law called Snell's law, and it is known as, it is basically this sine inverse of the refractive index of the denser medium to the rarer medium. What I mean by refractive index is, refractive index basically tells us about the speed of light, which is when it is traveling through the medium. So it is governed by the ratio of the speed of light in vacuum or air to the speed of light in the medium. So certainly the light travels slower in the mediums than in comparison to the vacuum or air. So that makes this number refractive index greater than 1. So here we have got, in our experiment, we have got water as the denser medium whose refractive index is around 1.33, and the air which is treated as the refractive index 1. So in this experiment, as we can see in this picture, the setup shows we got to have a laser, which is our light source, which is a very narrow band light source. Then we got to have a beaker or a bottle or a jar with water with a hole at certain level, so that we can pass the laser light through it. And then we got to have an empty beaker to pour the water into it. So how we are going to perform the experiment is that we are going to focus the laser on the opposite side of the hole in the water bottle, which is filled with water, and we are going to have a beaker which is empty, where the water is going to come. And then we are giving you a screen where we can see how the light is bending. So let us start the experiment. Here we can see the light is now straight, like it is little bit bent, but it is not following because there is no water flow, so it is not following anything. So at the interface of the air and water, we are getting a little bit bending away from the normal, which is like this. So when we are going to let the water flow, so this spot has gone, there is no light here, and I can show you that the light is following my hand. So the light is basically following the flow of the water. So the light is bending here at this point, and then this point, and this point, and this point. So this way it is getting totally internally reflected at every interface that it is having water and air. So we understood here that how the light bends at the curvature, how we can use this light to transfer information from this point to this point following a medium. This is basically typically what happens in case of an optical fiber, where the light is fed into from one point and it's taken from the glass based material through several distances, and it maintains the flow of information in a very secured manner. Thank you very much.
Hello friends, so today we are going to demonstrate the principle of gyroscopic effect. A gyroscope is a device with a spinning wheel or spinning disc, and it harnesses on the principle of preserving the angular momentum. And as we know from Newton's law that if we apply force to a body, it will try to increase the momentum of the body in the direction of force. So similar happens when it comes to the angular velocity. So if we want to change the angular momentum, then we need to apply a torque. So for that, in the direction of torque, there is a change of the angular momentum. Now this simple device, actually it has a tendency to protect it from any change of the angular momentum if it's subject to a external torque. Now this simple device actually can create a extraordinary effects which is used in almost in every navigation system, like aircraft, like ships and rockets. So without spin, so this is a gyroscope, actually this is a model of gyroscope. Without any spinning, the device does not have any significant effect. But whenever it is subjected to a angular spin, it actually offers two properties. One is rigidity and second one is precision. So due to this rigidity, actually it opposes any change in the direction of the spin angular momentum, and due to the precision and due to this weights, actually it rotates around the pivot, and it defies the gravitational effects. So we will demonstrate it with some few of our experimental arrangements. So first, this is our gyroscope. This is a simple, you can see this is a gimbal kind of structure, and it rotates around this axis. So what happens if we don't give it a spin? So it just, if we want to place it on a pedestal, it just falls down. So but what happens when we will give it its angular momentum? So let's see, this is a thread, and with this thread we will provide a spin to this structure. So now you can see it actually stabilized, and it actually defies the gravity. Whenever there was a spin, it actually defies the gravity. And how it happens? So you can see, so this is the direction of the angular momentum. So when the weight is working in the downward direction, so this weight actually creates a torque. That torque works in this direction. As a result, when it's spinning, it has a precession moment due to this torque, and as a result it defies the gravity. So we can demonstrate this with the bicycle wheel also. So this is our bicycle wheel, and this is a motor. So with this motor we'll provide this bicycle a spin. So you can see that without the spin, if we don't give this bicycle wheel a spin, then if we want to hang it by rope, then it just falls down. So now what we will do, we'll give it a angular momentum with this motor. So now you see, so this actually defies the gravity and it actually presses around this rope. We'll try to demonstrate how the rigidity of a gyroscope actually stabilizes the whole system. To show the rigidity of a gyroscopic device, what we have used, this is a disc and this is attached to a CD. So this disc is actually free rotating. Now we have at the back side of the CD, we have used a motor. This is any kind of simple motor that is used in any kind of toy, and this is run by a 9-volt battery. So now when we switch on this disc start rotating. Now if we want to place it on a table, it just falls down. But when we give it a spin, so it stands. Not only it stands, if we want to disturb it, it does not fall down. So this is an extreme rigidity that is shown by gyroscopic effect, and because of this rigidity, this gyroscope actually used any kind of spacecraft, rocket and ships to give it a particular direction of navigation and a particular rigidity. So gyroscope is a extremely useful device which are used in our everyday life, and it is mainly based on the principle of conservation of angular momentum. Thank you.